Okay, I'm in the Gospel of John, chapter 17, and in this message I'll be pressing forward into verse 4. John chapter 17, verse 4. Now, what's happening is that Jesus is praying. This is the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer in the sense of how he is going to pray to his God. Usually when people think of the Lord's Prayer, they're thinking about the prayer that he said that you are to pray before your God, which of course was a prayer that would put you in a situation where you would realize that you have no hope of having a relationship with God outside of his grace and mercy alone. And so this is the way that the Lord is going to pray to his God. This is at the end of his ministry, and I spent a lot of time talking about verse 3 and the implications related to eternal life being about knowing our God. And I spent a lot of time talking about the obstacles that people have to get through if they're going to have eternal life in that kind of a context. I spent a lot of time talking about why people do not want to know their God, and it has a lot to do with the decisions that people make with regards to how they are going to solve the problems of life. So I spent a lot of time talking about that in the previous messages in verse or related to verse 3. In verse 4, he speaks to his God about completing the work that was given for him to do. Right? And so going to verse 4, this is John chapter 17, verse 4. Jesus said, I have glorified you on the earth. I have finished the work which you have given me to do. And of course, I've spent a lot of time talking about the idea of glorifying God and that Jesus glorified him. And what that really meant was that he made God known. You know, to say that he's glorified is just an exotic word to describe the idea that he is going to be made known. You know, if I'm going to be made known, we don't call that we're going to glorify Aaron. You know, that just isn't the same. You know, it doesn't fit, it doesn't apply, it's not going to. But when we speak about God, we have a special word to describe making him known. We call that glorification, glorifying, glorified. Most people would like to think of it in the context of, well, we are going to sing worship songs to him. And, you know, that's okay. But I think that's a very limited view of what that word means and what that word implies. All right, so you have Jesus who is speaking to his God about the completion of the work. Now, I think it's important to take a moment and think about what is God really wanting to accomplish? You know, I mean, what's his real objective? I've spent a lot of time talking about this in the previous messages, that God's primary objective, as far as I can tell, what he's really doing and what he's wanting to accomplish is he's wanting to have people in his life because they want to be in his life. All right. Now, you know, the angels didn't have that kind of an option. He created the angels and God was in their presence. They were in his. That's just the way things were. So they were in his life because that was a part of them being created. They didn't really have much of a choice in the matter. Many of them did make a choice to reject the relationship that God had defined between the two of them, and those became the demons. So they could reject the relationship that they started with, but there would be no means of redemption to return to a healthy and constructive and eternal relationship with their God. With us, we start out in the other direction, from the other point of view. We start out without knowing our God, without having a relationship with him of any kind. And so the redemption has to do with the collective context of the fall of humanity, and God has made a provision for redemption for those who would like to have a relationship with him. Now, of course, this relationship is on his terms, not ours. This is a real big challenge for a lot of people to get in touch with, is that the relationship is one that he is going to define. You know, I mean, you've got to surrender to the kind of relationship that he is willing to have with you. It's not an agreement in the sense of, okay, let me evaluate that and I'll decide. Maybe we should negotiate a few things and make some adjustments. That's not the way things are. I mean, with us, we need to have things like that. We can't just have a relationship based on force or based on surrender. That's not a relationship that would be something that would be of interest to everybody involved. Of course, there are a lot of people who don't care about other people, and so, that's their thing. I spoke a little bit about this in the previous message. But our God has defined a relationship, and we can either surrender to it or not. Now, in this case, you could say, well, maybe his idea of a relationship is not a good one, Well, if that's what you may think, and there are people who do have that opinion, in this way, you really have to trust that the creator of all things, the one who has created all things, that he's got a good idea. He's got the right idea. He does have the proper perspective of what a relationship between him and his creation should be like. And the more that you trust in him, the easier it will be for you to embrace what he is willing to have with you. And the more that you grow to understand that and experience that, as for myself, I'll say, he really does have the best in mind. He really does, and it's not about him just having a bunch of servants in his life. That's not what he's doing or what he's involved in. That he did design us to live and function in a specific way. And when we live and function in the way that he has designed, we will have the greatest opportunity for peace and happiness and joy. And these are good things. All right. So he has defined a relationship that he is willing to have with people. And those who are willing to surrender to that kind of a relationship and embrace that, those are the people that he's looking for. He's looking for people who want to know him as a person, for example. Is that reasonable? Of course it's reasonable, And so there are things about this relationship that he's wanting to have with people, and this is the work that he is doing. All right, this is the work that he is doing. In order for people to have this choice, you have to have the choice to choose otherwise. All right, you need to have the option to choose otherwise, and you will see that the overwhelming majority of people decide to reject their God. It's always been like that, as far as I can tell. It always will be that way. So God gets the few, he gets the minority of people who will be born into this world, live their lives from the womb to the tomb. He will get the minority, he will get this smaller amount. But some is a lot better than none. Okay, and those who he will gain are those who will be of the quality that he wants to have in his life forever, for eternity. This is a big deal. So if Jesus is God manifested in the flesh, right? If God manifests in the flesh and comes to live among us as a man, if he's going to do that, if he's going to live a life just like we live a life from the womb to the tomb, if he's going to do that, then one of the things that you would, of course, expect of him as a man and also as God is you would expect him to be a participant in this work. A participant in the objective of God, that he would be involved, that he would contribute to the efforts of getting people to make the decision to embrace their God for who he is and to enter into the relationship that he has defined, to surrender to the covenant that he has established. You would expect him to be a participant in that. Obviously, God is a participant in our lives in various ways. So, for us to be here as people, we have the opportunity to be participants in his life. Okay? Now, one thing that I want you to notice is that when Jesus lived his life, all right, when God was here living as a man, and he lived his life, I want you to notice that the majority of his life was spent in a way that it did not really appear that he was actively involved in participating in the work of God. It does not appear to be the case. And I say that in the sense that his ministry began when he was baptized by John the Baptist. That was when his ministry really got going. That's when it got initiated and when he began his work. And he worked for about 3 years. All right. Now, from what we can tell, he was somewhere in the range of about 30 years old. And so if he was about 30 years old and he worked in the ministry for the last 3 years of his life, then we could put a percentage on that and say, it's about 10%. About 10% of his life, of his waking hours, to say it that way even, about 10% of his life was spent being a participant in the work of God, in the way that he was, in an overt, a productive, constructive, recognizable, public way. All right, about 10%. It wasn't the majority of his life experience. He was here living his life, and 90% of his life was spent doing things for himself, and for others, but not in the context of him being the Messiah, not in the context of him being a participant in drawing people to their God, not in the way that he was doing so during his ministry. We don't have information concerning what he may have been doing before that. We don't have a lot. We have a couple of examples in the Gospel of Luke where Luke recorded a few things. But the way that he did it in a way that everybody recognized that he's just a guy like everybody else. Everybody saw him in that way. His brothers saw him in that way. The people identified him as, this is Jesus, son of Joseph, just like one of us. I spoke about this from the earlier chapters, John chapter 4, if I recall correctly. And so, he did not reveal himself for who he really was until later, and he did not actively reach out to people with the truth of their God until later on in his life. And so, we can sometimes feel a sense of pressure, right? We can sometimes feel a sense of pressure of, well, what are you doing for God lately? What are you doing for the ministry lately? And people can feel a sense of pressure, some stress, and some condemnation. What are you doing for God, kind of thing. Well, Jesus only spent about 10% of his life doing things that we would consider to be in that category. And so, how should we evaluate that amongst ourselves? Should we say, well, 10% of your life had better be spent like that if you want to be like Jesus? I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think that's a good idea at all. If 3% of your life is spent encouraging people to have a personal relationship with their God, I think that's wonderful. What about myself? For the last 15 years, it's been about 100% for myself. Should I feel bad? Should I feel guilty or condemned? Because, gosh, you really put in a lot. You put in way too much, You put in way too much. Is that what I should think about? What about the 15 years before that? The 15 years before that, I would say it was looking like maybe somewhere between 5 and 10%. And that was mainly just because I didn't have a donation base. What I do right now, what I've been doing for the last 15 years to date this recording, I'm still alive. I still got a few more years to go. But the only reason why I was able to do 100% was because people donated. I've been functioning only on the donations, just people giving. And of course, I have to ask people, will you give so that I can work? And I don't enjoy asking people to just give. It would be nice, I suppose, if I had something to sell, but I've not done that. That's not the model that I've used. It's the way it goes, and it's outside of my character, so I don't do it very often. And when I do, it takes a lot of effort for to bring it out of myself, to ask people, will you give me money so I can work? It's tough, but that's the kind of model that I've been operating under, and that's what has made it possible for me to put in 100% of my time. And looking back and looking at the testimonials that I have on record, I would say it was definitely worth it. And on that basis, I don't mind so much when I absolutely really need to. I don't mind asking people to donate so that I can continue to work, and perhaps in the future, the testimonials and the effect will look similar, hopefully better, than from the past. But, that's 100%. And for the last 15 years, all right? I've put in 100% for 15 years. Jesus did 100% for about 3 years. So, if you want to make a comparison between me and Jesus, you could say, well, gosh, Aaron, you have done 5 times the amount of work for the ministry as Jesus has done, percentage-wise, if you consider things. All right. Now, that's a bad comparison because, of course, he's done some wonderful things, right? I mean, no comparison if you were to look at it at magnitude and effectiveness. But if you would look at it from the point of view of time, I've put in 5 times the amount so far than what Jesus did. And so, should I esteem some sense of pride for that? Obviously not. I'm definitely not considered, should never be considered to be greater than Jesus in any respect whatsoever. And so when people feel a sense of condemnation because they think that maybe they're not doing enough, well, even if they're doing more than what would be considered to be enough, or more than what Jesus did, if you consider time, you still shouldn't esteem some sense of pride or esteem some sense of accomplishment or, to compare yourself with other people. There still is no room for that, all right? Whatever you do is good. Whatever you do, for God to be able to make use of it is good. I don't think that there should be any opportunity for condemnation one way or the other, and there definitely should be no opportunity for pride one way or the other. So, how should we look at it? Well, personally, this is the way that I have functioned, so I can testify a little bit from a personal point of view, all right? Because I definitely cannot tell you what your relationship with your God is to be. I can't do that. But from my own point of view and from my own life, there have been some times when I do have the conviction that he has sent me to do specific things. There have been times when I've done that, and there have been some times when I just decided to do it even though I didn't have any special, unique conviction that it was something that God specifically sent me to do. I just did it because I wanted to. And there have been a few occasions when God has asked me to do something, and I will confess, I said no at first, and then when the time came, I came through and I did it. All right, but there have been some moments in my life when I thought I don't think so. I'm doing really well. I've got all these great accomplishments. I got this future ahead of me. No, I don't think I want to just give it all up in order to just do the ministry full time. Well, when the time came, okay, I'll do it, So, and of course, I don't have any regrets about that. So, this is a relational experience, and it is an individual experience. But I'd like you to see that fundamentally what this is about being a participant in the work of God, to be involved in doing the things that contribute to his objectives. When he came here to live as a man, he put in, 3 out of 30 years of his life devoted specifically for this objective. So, what were some of the things that he did? I mean, if he said, we're in John chapter 17, verse 4, he said, I have glorified you on the earth. I have finished the work which you have given me to do. What What was that work? Well, he did a lot. There were a lot of things that he did. And if we were to take the time to try and generate a list of the testimony that we have concerning what he did, and those who wrote their testimonies, in the Gospels, they said that he did a lot more than what's written down here. This is just some of the things that we just decided to document, that they decided to write down. He did a whole lot more that has been forgotten, forgotten from a historical point of view, and from the future generations, was definitely experienced by those who were present and who were living at that time. And of those people who are in the kingdom of heaven, they, of course, those things will be remembered. But for us, we don't know what those things are. This could be a wonderful opportunity for you to have some interesting conversations with those who are already in heaven when you get there. Well, what were some of these things? What do you remember? And they probably will be able to tell you, let me tell you about what happened on this day and in this circumstance. And nobody said anything about it, but we'll tell you about it now. We'll tell you what happened. That's something to look forward to. I'm sure that there will be some people who can recall these kinds of things, and you can learn a lot more about what Jesus did. But, if we were to generate a list of what it is that we know concerning the testimony that we do have on record, that would be a long list. I'm not even going to try to do that. That's going to take a lot of time, and I'll feel awkward if I miss a few things too. So even then, I still would hesitate in trying to accomplish that task. But I can identify a few things that I think are worthy of mentioning at this time and in this context of what he said here in John chapter 17, as I'm doing a verse-by-verse presentation on this, that there are a few things that I would like to mention that describe him accomplishing the work that was given for him to do. All right, so I will do that. I got a few things that I'd like to mention. The first thing that I think should be pointed out is that he was there to be himself. I do. I think that is something that really comes out in terms of the work that he came to do. He was just there to be himself, which is good considering that he is God. All right, now for us to be ourselves, well, that includes the sinful nature too. And so we don't necessarily want to exaggerate these negative aspects about ourselves. It's reasonable to acknowledge them and to understand them. However, it is not a justification for evil. It's not a justification to say that it's okay, because it's not. But for him to be himself, yeah, that is good. And that, I think, was a work for him to do, to really be himself. Now, he was himself in a limited way. He was there living as a man, and so he limited the expression of himself, but he was still himself, at least in the ways that he could do so to stay within the boundaries of what it would be like if he was living as a man. Okay? Consider what it might be like if you were to go on a camping trip, for example. If you go on a camping trip, you're going to, sometimes people will call it roughing it. You're not plugged into the public utility grid. You don't have running water, you don't have electricity, you don't have the natural gas, the energy, the fuel, you don't have the building, so you're going to rough it a little bit. You're still going to be yourself, but you're not going to be yourself in the same way as you would be if you were contained in a building that was plugged into the public utility grid. There'd be some limitations. I'm trying to give you an example that maybe you could relate to. And so some people can appreciate that. Other people probably can't appreciate that at all. But, my point is to say that he was there and yet he was still himself within the boundaries that he was willing to subject himself to in order to accomplish a number of other tasks. But to be himself is a big deal. That is a big deal because through being himself, he can make himself known. That people would have an opportunity to see him and to get to know him without being overwhelmed by, the magnitude of his eminence that could be so intense that he would be completely unapproachable. And then what? How are you going to get to know someone who is unapproachable? That just doesn't work. All right, what else did he accomplish that I could mention? He came to proclaim the truth. That was a work that he was clearly given to do, to proclaim the truth. All right, and the truth regarding the context of the circumstances and the situations that he was in. He was given the task of revealing and proclaiming the truth about his God, and of course, the truth about other people. Okay? And this was given for him to do. And of course, there were a lot of people who felt quite uncomfortable about the revelation of the truth. Now, there have been some times when I believe the Lord has encouraged me to proclaim the truth. And there's probably been more times when I have decided to do that outside of his encouragement. And I will say that there have been a few occasions when it just wasn't constructive. It just didn't, as far as I could tell, it was not a good thing. And so I have tried to learn some sense of wisdom, of on occasion, maybe I shouldn't tell the truth. It doesn't mean I should lie. It just means that I should just be quiet. There have been some times when it probably would have been more useful for me to just simply not expose the truth of people, of circumstances, of things that, it just wasn't useful. Now, I don't know, maybe one day the people who were exposed to the truth that I revealed, maybe one day they'll have some sense of conviction about that. Maybe they won't. I don't know. It's really not my problem. It's theirs. But there is an opportunity for God to ask us to testify the truth. There is an opportunity for us to do so without his asking us. And of course, there can be some times when this can be useful, other times when it's not. If God encourages me to testify the truth and I do so, and there's some protest involved, I definitely have no concern about that whatsoever. But when I know that, God didn't instruct me to do that or send me to do that, sometimes I can feel a little awkward if things don't turn out so well. I can. Nothing wrong with that at all. But Jesus, was here to proclaim the truth. And there would be some consequences related to that. The hope is that a good consequence is that people will respond to the truth in a good way. That they would respond to the truth in a good way. And if they do, then they will be drawn to their God so that they could be closer and closer to him as a person, and that his objectives and goals would have a higher probability of being achieved. This was a work that Jesus was given to do. He was there to teach the old covenant. Now, this is a tough one for people to consider. All right, but this is an important thing to recognize, that when Jesus was teaching and he was conducting his ministry, the old covenant was the covenant that was in effect, and that was what he was teaching and proclaiming. The new covenant went into effect after he died. Now, in the previous chapters, the recent chapters, 13, 14, 15, 16, I gave you some examples of him proclaiming on occasion the new covenant that was to come. But he was still fundamentally teaching the old covenant. All right? And there were purposes to teaching the old covenant. There were reasons why. You have to consider that the people who he was relating to, the people were people who were religious. Okay, and I'm using the definition of that word, religious, to say that they were embracing a system of bondage in order to establish their right standing with their God by what they did or by what they didn't do, through their repentance and through their obedience. Okay, this was the character, the purpose, the objective of the people who he was primarily communicating with. They were religious people, and they needed to come to the end of this pursuit in order to embrace the forgiveness of God for what it was, for what it is. To embrace the forgiveness of God so that you can have a relationship with him based on what he has done for us, not on the basis of what we do for him. Big change, all right? There's a big difference, and I'm not going to try to describe the differences between the Old and the New Covenant in this message. I've done other messages that get into that in more detail. It has to do with living by the inheritance that we have received as a result of his death, instead of living by our obedience with hope that we will be blessed by God in our flesh. Okay? So he was reaching out to people, the people who he was relating to, were people who were very religious, okay? And they were very devoted to repentance and obedience, but they needed to be set free from that. This was an obstacle that was in the way that was keeping them from being loved and accepted by their God. It would be an obstacle that would keep them from embracing the new covenant that was about to go into effect. It was an obstacle. They needed to be set free from this obstacle. So the way that he did it was he put more obstacles in their life. Okay, consider the Sermon on the Mount, for example, when he spoke about, your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, they were doing as great, as good as they could do. They were doing great if you were to compare them with other people. But it still wasn't going to be good enough. So Jesus gave some examples. He said it's not just about what you do in your flesh, but it's also the condition of your heart. If you think about committing sin, it's just as bad as doing it. When he added more obstacles, his disciples would finally ask him, well, who then can be saved? And he says, that's the point. With men, it is impossible. All right? It's not going to happen that way. So that was his ministry. His ministry was to reach out to the religious, that they would hopefully come to the end of their religion and embrace the new covenant by surrendering to his forgiveness and his grace and mercy. This is a whole, this is a whole thing that most people miss. They're the most religious, those of Christianity, will memorize what he has said, in order to try to inspire themselves and encourage themselves. And on occasion, you'll find people who will admit, well, yeah, you're right. We definitely cannot do all that Jesus said, but we got to try. We got to try. We got to get as close as we can. Well, who do you think you're fooling? Who really? I'll tell you what they really mean. What they really mean is, we still have to do it better than you, or other people. We just need to do it well enough that we can compare ourselves with other people, so that when God, makes a decision about who's going to be saved, well, we'll be more in the percentage of those who he probably would select, because he's definitely not going to have those people who are a bunch of wicked, evil, sinful people who don't even try. Okay? And that's what they're counting on. That's what they're counting on. But this is what Jesus was doing. He was teaching the old covenant to get people to the end of that. And ever since then, every generation has got its group of people who keep trying. They just keep trying. They live, they die. And then there's another generation of people who just keep trying, And if they're going to be saved, it's not going to be because of that. That's for sure. God is going to be merciful to people. And how he works that out, we will find out, exactly how he works those things out. In the meantime, the important thing is for us to know and understand and embrace the new covenant as he defined it. All right, what else did he do? He came to fulfill prophecy. That was a big part of what he did. Said it a lot. What was the work that he completed? He fulfilled, not all prophecies, of course, but many prophecies, the ones that were related to what he was doing. Through fulfilling prophecy, it becomes a testimony of the truth to those who would be classified as unbelievers. It's a testimony to the unbelievers that maybe they will now believe things like, yeah, there probably really is a God. And if there is, then you know what? What he thinks probably has some relevance. It probably does. I can't tell you how many people I have said that to. I've said this to a lot of people. And just about every single one of them give me this blank stare of, what you just said has no relevance. The idea that you think that there is a God and that what he thinks has relevance doesn't even have any relevance. Because I don't care what you think. I'm only in your presence because I want to figure out what I can take from you. That's what I've encountered in my life experience, an abundance of people like this. But what he thinks really does matter. And when there is a prophecy that is proclaimed centuries in advance, and then it is fulfilled in a way that it is obvious that this was a divine expression, that this is a revelation that there really is a God, there's an opportunity, there is an opportunity for people to consider, well, if there is a God, then maybe what he thinks actually matters. Maybe it has some relevance to life, to my life, to who I am, to my future and my present, in my past too. And there will be some, okay? There will be some. I have found very few, but there will be some who will respond to that. Okay? But hey, some is better than none. I responded to that. That was a big motivation for me when I thought, my goodness, there must really be a God. Here's evidence for that. I suppose I had to find out what he thinks. Because of course I have a lot of opinions myself, but they probably don't have any relevance whatsoever in comparison with what he thinks. And so I have devoted the majority of my life to discover what he thinks so that I can be corrected. I can be adjusted. This has been an important part of my existence. And of course, I'm still learning things and I enjoy that. All right. But for Jesus to fulfill prophecy was a work that God gave him to do. It was an important work and he did that. He completed that. This is good. To divide people. All right. And he said that I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring conflict and division. That's what he was doing. He was dividing people. But who was he what was the division? The division was between those who would want to know their God and those who wouldn't. He wasn't there to save everybody. All right. That's not what he was doing there. He was there in order to facilitate the division. That was an important work. And much of what he did accomplish that. To solve the problem that existed between God and humanity. Obviously, that was an important work. Now, this was, of course, fully accomplished when he died and rose from the dead, because it was then that he forgave the sins of the world, and he provided for the opportunity for people to receive the Holy Spirit of God within them so that they could be resurrected from the dead. Sin entered into the world through Adam and Eve when they violated the law of God. That was the introduction of sin into the world. And as a consequence, everyone has engaged in sin since then, and everyone is accountable for their own personal sins. And the other consequence that Adam and Eve experienced was spiritual death. And what that meant was that the life of God, the Spirit of God, was within them upon creation. And when they rejected their God, he departed. Fine. You guys can go ahead and do it on your own. In fact, get out of my garden. Go make your own. You can do it. So there's a little bit of sweat involved. I've encountered people who live their lives as if to break a sweat is the most evil thing that could ever occur in life. All right. But, that's what happened. God departed from within them, and they were spiritually dead. Okay, because they did not have the spiritual life within them. Jesus came to do the work to solve this problem. Sin and death was solved through forgiveness of the sin and, of course, restoring the life that was lost in Adam to those who are willing to surrender to God under his terms according to his covenant. This was a work. This was the primary work that Jesus was involved in, and that was accomplished through his death and his resurrection. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pause here before I proceed further into John chapter 17. For those of you who are using this for your small groups, I do have a question that I think is good to consider using to facilitate discussion. Is there a work God has given you that you completed? Is there a work that God has given that you would say, God sent me to do this, he asked me to do this, he inspired me to do this, and I did it? Do you have an example of that? And of course, if you don't, don't be thinking like you're a second-class believer, or you have a problem that needs to be solved. No one should be condemned over this. Consider Jesus, for example. His ministry was the last 3 years of his life. If you have another 3 years to go, there's obviously plenty of time, for him to give you something to do. And if he doesn't, so be it. You can do something without him asking you on his behalf. But is there an example? Is there an example of this? I can remember personally in my early years in the faith that there were a few occasions when I could say, God sent me to do something specific. And it usually had to do with just simply talking with some people. And those conversations were only, maybe a few minutes, a few hours, and that was it. But they were lifelong, impactful conversations, not just for them, but also for me. And I knew that God had sent me to go and do that. What was really interesting for me to see was how he prepared me to do those works. Usually it would take about 2 years, and I had no idea that he was preparing me for those until after the events, when I could realize, my goodness, I could not have been so effective with communicating with these people. I could not have done that unless he revealed to me these other things in the usually about 2 years prior to that event, to that moment that he asked me to go and be his representative to those people. All right, so I have some examples of that, some testimonies personally that I could mention. Do you have any examples of that? If you don't, fine. That's perfectly fine. I'm just thinking that this could be a good opportunity to facilitate some conversations. All right, and if you don't have one, just give an example of when you decided to do something on your own and some things that you hope may have transpired from that. And I will continue into John chapter 17 in the next message. Thanks.